This comes from Encounter with the Self by Edward Edinger, and it comes from picture 6, and it's about how we find out what we should be and where the self is taking each one of us. And so this was a piece of prose that was written by one of Dr. Edward Edinger's patients, and it was after that patient had experienced some intense pain, and so this patient wrote this piece. Going to school to Pain. Pain says, if one would teach, he must first get the student's attention. I am an excellent attention getter. I am deep. If you would not fear me, be deep like me. I come from the center. A point is my sign. A stab from me is the cosmic goad. If you would not fear me, live each present moment with the same intensity that you experience me. I am the great purifier. Only the essential can endure me. All else is burnt away. I am the great valuer. All values come from me and my partner, death. I am the gateway to the mysteries. An image of me is your highest concept of the sacred. I am the quintessential now. I lie in ambush for those who miss their daily dose of life. This elixir, unconsumed, accumulates and overspills its little vial, raining its concentrated torrent on the negligent soul. I am the angel of annunciation for the awesome now. Time is a gliding serpent bearing precious jewels upon its back, each jewel a present moment. I guess that's a long way of saying Carpe Diem. It also made me think of a reason that many people go to psychotherapy, and what at least Jungian analysts are looking for, which is a defeat, some pain. You come to some point in your life and it's painful, and then you have to ask yourself why. And so James Hillman at one point in one of the lectures he was giving said, can't we find a defeat in here somewhere? And so the point is, we all have defeats in life, and those defeats and they are painful, are our way of finding our way and finding ourself, finding the philosophical gold in ourselves if we can. This was a meme that was passing around the internet. It came to me, and then the next day my wife gave it to me from a Buddhist site, so it must have something to do with both Jungian psychology and Buddhism, and it's called Your Real Self. Meditation is nothing but a device to make you aware of your real self, which is not created by you, which need not be created by you, which you already are. You are born with it. You are it. It needs to be discovered. If this is not possible, or if the society does not allow it to happen, and no society allows it to happen, because the real self is dangerous. Dangerous for the established church, dangerous for the state, dangerous for the crowd, dangerous for the tradition, because once a man knows his real self, he becomes an individual. He no longer belongs to the mob psychology. He will not be superstitious, and he cannot be exploited, and he cannot be led like cattle. He cannot be ordered and commanded. He will live according to his light. He will live from his own inwardness. His life will have tremendous beauty, integrity, but that is the fear of the society. I think that that's very valuable definition to keep in mind. You know, the church is afraid of Dr. Jung because if you have your own experience of God, then you have no need to believe. You have no need for a creed because you do know yourself. And what I'm trying to convey to theologians like Paul Vanderklay is, one, Paul has agreed to have a conversation with me on Zoom in September, but what I'm trying to convey is that we need to know where the Spirit is going, and Christianity can revivify itself if it addresses that issue and addresses the issue of giving people the experience of God. Because if it's just on he says, she says, then, you know, people that are atheists aren't going to get aboard. But if people actually have experience and learn the experience, they will understand it. And of course, this has been used for decades in places like Alcoholics Anonymous, but that's all been kept very hush-hush, and who wants to find out what a 12-step program is if you don't have an addiction, for example. But the reality is that one of the basic tenets of a 12-step program is to have this religious experience that I'm talking about. And if you have it, you know. And if you haven't had it, then it's probably worth your while to try to figure out how it happens. And it does happen. And it happens to me almost every day. It's just a question of recognizing it. You know, when my daughter told me 20 years ago that she thought I was going to hell on her 22nd birthday, that was quite an astounding experience for me. I did have a psychogenic experience with Mephistopheles as I had envisioned him when I read Faust. Okay, so when I read Faust, I had a vision of what Mephistopheles was like. And that's the vision, that's the image that was in my mind, and that's the image that popped up and plopped down in the seat next to me in my automobile. Now, I think that amounts to a cheap trick, which some sects of Christianity have used to scare people into coming into the church, because if that happens to me, it can happen to lots of people, obviously. And people 100 years ago wouldn't have had the kind of information I have to understand what the significance of such an experience is. You know, that was certainly a religious experience in a negative sense. And so I know the power of that particular religious experience. Obviously, I've had many positive ones too. But my point is that, okay, that's a trick to scare people psychologically into coming into Christianity, but that's not the way to do it. Somehow that has to get conveyed to Christian theologians in order to, you know, quite literally save Christianity, I think. That's my opinion. Andy says, before Bill W. died, he begged everyone for some whiskey. True story. Okay, maybe he did, but he stayed sober for about 40 years, and so I think that that's a good sign. And considering that I had a grandfather who died of alcoholism, I think that that's a worthwhile thing. Whatever the ineffable may be, it kept Bill W. sober for 40 years, and at the end of his life, he was attributing that success and the success of Alcoholics Anonymous to Dr. Jung. So I think that that's very significant. Soul Life says, I am able to get a general feeling of the references which you're describing. Of course, the more details I am given, the more it gets complicated and vague. I wonder what preparation could help me. Well, I think that the preparation that can help you is simply reading some of the easier Jungian stuff first. Don't just jump into the Red Book, because you won't understand what that is. Read Man and His Symbols, which is a book that Dr. Jung intentionally wrote for laymen, and then read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And in fact, there's a couple of videos that sort of give you a syllabus on this YouTube channel, which you can find. In fact, lecture number 3, which this is session number 89. If you go back to lecture number 3, which was before we were actually having meetings, when I was just talking to my iPhone back 2 years ago, you will find a syllabus there, and that will tell you how to step through it. What I would say about the Red Book is that the Red Book represents a visioning period that Dr. Jung had, and I think of it as very analogous to the kind of visioning that Job was doing 2,500 years ago, and the kind of visioning that happened to me during my novel writing period in 1993. Those are religious experiences, and so unless you understand the context of what those are, it's probably not the place to start. And Andy correctly says you just have to hammer them out. Andy says, I had an antithetical religious experience, but it led me to the same place. This is a fairly well-documented phenomenon. The visioning experience you reference is highly relevant. Yeah, I presume so, because I've had a few of them. That particular experience with Mephistopheles was quite special, of course, but it did make me understand how theologians use the trickster to get people into the pews. I'd rather have the theologians getting us into the pews, because we understand what's happening and where the Spirit is taking us. That's the point. And so I think the fundamental answer is, if I had really thought about it, I probably would not have assigned the Spirit Mercurius as an essay for this group at this point, simply because it's one of Dr. Jung's way too complicated, prodigious scholarship, and you can really get lost in the weeds. But I think it's worthwhile to look at. It's in volume 13 of the collected works, Alchemical Studies, and if you look beginning at page 237, that 10 pages is a place to start, because that's the summary. And it's talking about the Spirit, and as I said earlier in this evening, the Spirit is taking us everywhere. It makes all of us do everything we do all day long. And Dr. Jung was only going back and talking about how medieval or early Iron Age men were thinking about this. That's well and good, because he felt he had to cover his tracks and have full scholarship, or otherwise it's, hey, I'm Carl and this is my idea, which is the type of stuff that we see on the internet all the time. And okay, you can launch an idea maybe, but geez, you may even get 1 million people to look at your idea. But if you do that on the internet, you haven't given it any staying power. So if it's a cool idea and it just falls away, that's not very powerful, but Dr. Jung did prodigious scholarship in German, English, Greek, and Latin, and some Arabic with translations from Chinese sufficient to establish very clearly what he was talking about. And this is why we're still talking about his work, and he's been dead for 57 years. So, and I suppose people will be talking about him for a lot more. And so Andy says, how did I wrap that experience into my everyday life? Well, I don't know, somehow, because I was already into my Jungian studies at that point, I just kept working at it. And then I didn't really know at that point, that was 1998, and I didn't even know the Red Book existed until 2009. I just kept working on my Jungian work in general, which had already begun, for other reasons, for reasons related to art, to writing, to painting, to my painting. When I started Archetype in Action in 2010, I thought it was mainly going to be to help artists do paintings that were going to be more powerful so that they could sell more, because obviously an archetypal painting is much more grabbing than a painting that tries to be a substitute for a camera. I mean, we have an adult education place over here in my city, and I've been to many of those art classes, and you'll see 30 people in the room, and they're all trying to paint a still life, and they're trying to be like a camera. And the thing is, we have cameras for that now. We don't need anybody to paint another picture that looks like a photograph. What we need is for people to paint a picture of that still life that comes from their heart, that comes from their own deep soul. A few of you have seen some of the paintings I've done. I'm not going to belabor it tonight. Gradually, it became more important to me, though, Andy, because at the time it happened, I didn't really realize that Dr. Jung's work was very much about religion. So I didn't really understand at that point. Probably I had read across it at some point. I probably didn't understand that Dr. Jung's work was as much about religion as it is, because I didn't even start reading Dr. Jung's actual work until 2005, and I had started reading it in 1987. I had started to read about it, but I hadn't read his direct work because I thought it was about clinical psychology. And it's only in the last 5 years that I've really grokked the fact that it's heavily about religion, and that's been repressed by the professional Jungian analysts and by the institutes. They haven't wanted to talk about the religious aspects of what his work really says and means. And it's only in the last year a new series is coming out called Jung's Red Book for Our Time. It's actually going to be a 3-volume series. So far, 2 volumes have been published, but that's those essays. There's 50 essays by Jungian analysts, and those essays are addressing this. But, the first one of those books came out in 2017, and so most people don't even understand the religious aspects, or aren't even aware that there are religious aspects in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. And I think that there are many Jungian analysts in the late 20th century, early 21st century, who had no clue about the Red Book, for example, never had any idea. And I know I visited a Jungian analyst in 2015, and she said that she had never read the Red Book, and I go, what? It's only that way that I've gotten into it. I just have kept at it, and I've kept at it, as I've said several times, and I'll say it once more. Whenever I'm in mental turmoil, and that is fairly frequently for a variety of reasons, and I think most people get themselves in mental turmoil one way or another, but as I started to get into the depths of Jung, I realized that it was actually serving for me like psychotherapy does. And so Dr. Jung is really my shrink, and even though he has been dead for 57 years, and I can pick up any piece of his work, anything at all, and start reading it, and immediately I think I enter this psychoid layer that I've talked about in previous videos, and it soothes me, it soothes my mental turmoil, and so it serves as psychotherapy for me. And people think that this is this is just airy-fairy stuff or something. A lot of scientific method folks and other types of psychotherapists might say that, but for lack of depth psychology, last year we lost 62,000 people to the opioid epidemic. So that's doctors who are, among other things, treating people with depression through opioids instead of getting to what really ails them at depth. And that's shameful. And I've said a couple times also that, very simply, we don't understand ourselves. And until we do, we are at risk of destroying the human race. And Dr. Jung saw that threat in his lifetime. He said so in his interview for the BBC, and it's very clear to me today, and all we have to do is look at the Spirit Mercurius as it has been represented by the trickster in modern American politics, and you can see the risk that we have. My 20 years of my time in the Marine Corps was mainly aimed at the threat, quote-unquote threat, which was the Soviet Union. And we have a president that looks awfully cozy with Russia today. And that is truly threatening to me. That's very frightening. And what's more frightening is that a lot of my peers, people my age who've served in the military, think it's perfectly okay what he's been doing. I don't think that at all. And so, whatever. Those are my observations. I'm going to cop out on getting into the great nitty-gritty detail of the Spirit Mercurius. I'm just going to tell you that the Spirit Mercurius is everything that makes us do things. And so we need to understand ourselves, and I think that there's some other things that are more important in Dr. Jung's oeuvre. So let's see, there is one other thing that I wanted to mention, and that is there's this question about astrology. So he's talking after the 6 things that we talked about at the beginning. In paragraph 285, he says, certainly gold making, as also chemical research in general, was of great concern to alchemy, but a still greater, more impassioned concern appears to have been, one cannot very well say the investigation, but rather the experience of the unconscious. That this side of alchemy was for long misunderstood is due solely to the fact that nothing was known of psychology, let alone of the superpersonal collective unconscious. So long as one knows nothing of psychic actuality, it will be projected, if it appears at all. Thus, the first knowledge of psychic law and order was found in the stars, and was later extended by projections into unknown matter. These two realms of experience branched off into sciences. Astrology became astronomy, and alchemy chemistry. On the other hand, the peculiar connection between character and the astronomical determination of time has only very recently begun to turn into something approaching an empirical science. The really important psychic facts can neither be measured, weighed, nor seen in a test tube or under a microscope. They are therefore supposedly indeterminable. In other words, they must be left to people who have inner sense for them, just as colors must be shown to the seeing, not to the blind. And so I thought I would read that simply because people often mistake that alchemy is about making gold, and it wasn't about that at all. And alchemists were kept around by kings because they were making chemicals that were worth something to the kings in various ways. Right, Andy Oxide says, people miss the fact that alchemy unveils the experiential psychic actuality. The allegorical references are universal in religious beliefs. And so, yes, I think that's a good point, and it's a point that I'm going to close on.